Hey everybody, welcome to V39 and some of my favorite stuff we do in biology, foundations of genetics and the idea of what Gregor Mendel, a monk in a Czechoslovakian garden, did many, many years ago. This is supposed to be kind of funny because he worked with peas and there's lots of peas he must have grown. Yeah, okay. So let me show up. Hey, um, why are we the way we are? When we think about the traits we possess, why do we have the traits that we do, and where do our traits come from? We've been talking a little bit about this from a DNA perspective in class, right? That you have certain genes, and genes make traits, and traits are things like lactase, or whether you have brown hair or brown eyes, and things like that. But let's not take for granted that we've not always known this. In fact, if you go back to Gregor Mendel's day, there really wasn't a very good understanding of what genetic principles account for the passing of traits from parents to offspring. Sure, we knew if you crossed a certain kind of bull and a certain kind of cow, you got a certain kind of calf, and it had usually some traits from both parents. But we didn't understand, we back in the 1800s, didn't understand how that happened. Before Mendel, then, back in the 19th century or even before then, people thought that traits could be freely mixed, like the Minotaur here you see here from mythology days, that you could mix something that was part man and part bull, and that traits were transmitted directly. That means that if you damaged your finger when you were younger, that when you passed on your traits to your offspring, you're going to pass on traits for a damaged finger because that's what you had. And you may already be suspicious of that comment because you know that individuals don't evolve and they can't pass on their DNA. But again, it's the 1800s. People didn't know any different. So the idea of the time, the idea around Mendel's day, was that of what's called a blending hypothesis. It seemed to be that when two people mated, or two plants, or two animals, that the traits from both parents kind of blended and melded together. Kind of like if somebody has blue paint and yellow paint and mix them together, you get green. They kind of average out, they kind of mix. And you've probably seen cases where this appears to be sort of valid. You could have a couple who he has brown hair and she has blonde hair, and the kids have brown hair, and you go, well, yeah, the traits kind of mixed. Or as an adult, he's 6 foot tall, and as an adult, she's 5'6", and as adults, all their kids are 5'9" or 5'10", and you go, yeah, those traits kind of averaged. But there's plenty of cases, of course, we can note where that's not true. So this idea of blending hypothesis was the idea of the day genetically, but there really wasn't a very good understanding of genes and genetics. So in comes Gregor Mendel. That's this guy over here. Gregor Mendel was a monk who was very interested in science. He actually wanted to be a biology teacher when he was younger, but he shot for the stars and just couldn't be a biology teacher, so he became a monk instead. And back then, monks were sort of Renaissance guys. They did a little bit of everything. He liked gardening, and in the monastery garden, he liked to experiment with different breeds of plants. So he decided to test, because he was kind of curious about biology, whether or not the blending hypothesis was really valid. Maybe that really wasn't how it worked. He had his suspicions. So Gregor Mendel chose to work with peas. The genus name for this is Pisum. Don't say it the other way. That sounds kind of rude. Thank you. Mendel chose to work with peas for quite a few reasons. One, that they were small and easy to grow, and you can grow a generation in a short period of time. There were many varieties or characteristics of peas that he could look at, like he could look at flower color, or how tall they were, or if their seed pods were constricted or inflated. That is, he could look at a number of traits. And so he became intrigued with that ability. He also was interested, hang on, he also was interested in peas because he could control the mating of each. He knew who the daddy pea plant was and the mama pea plant was. He could actually control which pollen mated which pollen went to which female plant, and therefore he knew the parent types. That was really important. And he could also control, through cross-pollination, he could control the mating types. It's kind of a similar idea, but since he could control who mated with whom, he could also control who did not mate with whom. Long way of saying he knew exactly which plant with which trait produced the sperm, which plant with which trait produced the egg, and then he could look at the offspring. That's what these peas here are. The peas are the offspring of that parent mating, and say, aha, can I match the trait from the dad and the trait from the mom with the traits in the offspring, and figure out how genetics works, how traits get passed from parent to offspring. So what he had to do to make this work, and let me get rid of Isomere, is he had 3 stages. First, he allowed the pea plants to self-fertilize for several generations to ensure that he had true breeding plants. That is, he made sure that only purple-flowered pea plants produced more purple-flowered pea plants. He did this for a number of generations. Then he performed crosses between these plants with different traits. In this case, he is crossing the pollen from the white-flowered male, if you will, to the purple female. Then he would get the peas, he would then grow them up, and then he would record the traits. In this case, he looked at purple-flowered pea plants and white-flowered pea plants. He crossed them, produced these peas. The peas are basically seeds, right? He grew up the seeds, and then he looked at and counted how many of each of the plants had the traits he was looking at. In this case, how many produced purple flowered plants and how many produced white ones. So in a typical experiment, Mendel mated 2 contrasting true breeding varieties, a process called hybridization. That is, he took purple flowered pea plants that only produced purple, he produced white flowered pea plants that only produced white, and he crossed them. He produced hybrids. And when he did so, he decided to designate the parent generation as the pea generation for parent. Not P as in the plant, but P as in the parent generation. He called their kids, their offspring, the F1 generation. F stands for filial, which is a Latin term for son. So basically, those were the offspring of the peas. So peas were the parents, F1 was their offspring. He would then allow the F1s to mate. And when he did that, he called their offspring the F2s. So we had 3 generations of plants. The initial parent generation, the F1, the offspring, and then the offspring's offspring, the F2. So here's how it looks. So, and we've already seen this, I'll go kind of quick through this. So these true breeding pea plants that only produce purple flowers, the true breeding pea plants that only produced white, he allowed them to mate, and the pea generation, they produced their offspring. This was the F1. In this case, he observed, well, they all had purple, and we'll come back to that in a second. When he allowed these plants to mate with themselves, that's another pea flower, these produced F2 generation plants, and in this case, he found some purples and some whites. So, let's look at what he found overall for his results, and see if we can make sense of it. Mendel reasoned that only the purple flower factor was affecting the flower color in the F1 hybrids. Let me go back a second. What did he really find? He found in this particular cross, when he crossed purple and white, he only got purple. All of the plants had purple. When these could cross against themselves, he found that he had purple, 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 and white. Okay, so already we can tell what about the blending hypothesis. Is it valid? If it was valid, I would not get purple here, right? I would get washed out purple, or white with purple spots, or purple with white stripes, or really pale purple. I didn't get it. I got something that's just as purple here as it was there. But the real way you can tell it's not blending is this. I got a white flowered plant again. If it was really blending, this trait would be gone. It wouldn't exist anymore. And in fact, it came out just as white as the one up here as the original pea plant, pea generation plant. So Mendel had to try to figure out how come he could get this, all purple here and then some purple and some white there. So his reasoning was, well, maybe the purple flower factor was affecting flower color in the F1 hybrids. Some factor, something the parents were passing along. Mendel called the purple flower color, the one he saw in the F1 generation, the dominant type, or the dominant trait, and he called the white flower color a recessive trait. Recessive means to hide. So his reasoning was, this purple must be dominant because it's kind of covering over the white traits, but the white traits still had to be there because they came back out in this generation. So Mendel's terms, again, were dominant and recessive. And he also observed this same pattern in 6 other pea plant characteristics. So when he looked at flower color, he saw this. He saw all purple in one generation, and then he saw purple and white. He saw for axial and terminal, which is the flower position, he had all axial flowers in the F1. He had axial and terminal in the F2. He had yellow and green pea plants producing their seeds. He found all yellow in the F1. He found all green in the F2. And this was true for all the traits he looked at. This is great, but Mendel noticed something else, and hopefully you see it too. He didn't just see these 2 traits. He looked at the ratio. He had about 3 purples to 1 white. He had about 3 axial to 1 terminal. He had about 3 yellow to 1 green. And you can keep going on down the list. For every trait he looked at, all 7 of these traits, he found the same basic ratio, about 3 of the dominant type to 1 of the recessive type. Okay, let's say that again. He found 3 dominants for every 1 recessive in the F2 generation. Clearly, blending inheritance is not working here. Something else is going on. And does that number, 3 to 1, does that ratio give us any hints as to what this pattern of inheritance really is? How are traits being passed from one generation to the next? We'll take up that issue and Mendel's reasoning, a hugely important video, coming up next. Thanks.